Okay, this is part 2 in our journey assembling the Prusa MK3S Plus. We will continue on with assembling the X-axis from the last video. So here's our 3D printed parts bag. We're going to grab the hardware bag. And we're going to lay out those parts for us to start assembling. Quite a few bearings in this one. So we'll be putting bearings into the 3D printed parts. We'll be putting bearings on some slide poles, and we will get those opened and cleaned up like we did last time so that the oil isn't everywhere. Just a little rub down with the napkin, and then we'll fit these bearings into these 3D printed parts. And we're going to make sure that the bearings inside are aligned as the picture indicates. So these are pretty tightly fitting parts, so I just use an Allen key here to pry open the space for the bearing so that it slides in a little bit easier. And you can see, even with it pried open slightly, they're still pretty tight to fit. And I'm just double checking there before I push it all the way in that the actual bearings inside are aligned as the assembly instructions indicate they should be. So I'll just use the table to push this bolt in. It's a little bit easier that way instead of trying to push it in with my thumb. And then we'll fit this bolt through. Make sure that the hole for it is clear and it screws in and out of the bolt there and really gets it seated in nicely before sliding in this little bearing part. It's actually a belt carrier, and that it spins freely. So we'll grab these two rods, we'll take out these remaining bearings out of their package, and the instructions indicate that we need to mark them in a specific way so that we can use those markings to align them in the correct position so that they ride nicely on these rails. So we'll use a Sharpie. Mine's pink, but that's fine, as long as you're able to mark them as the assembly instructions say to. And then we'll carefully slide those onto the rails. One rail gets 2 bearings, the other rail gets 1 bearing. And then we're going to go ahead and fit each rail onto these orange . And here you can see through the little window provided that the rods are far enough into the part. So we'll grab our X-axis motor. And we'll get it attached to these two rails that we just assembled. And we can see here, there's a little bit of room here for the screws to move back and forth. This is going to be used as leverage for the belt tightening system. You want this motor to move a little bit, and then you'll put tension on the belt and tighten it up. So for now, we're just gonna keep it tight until we get the belt on. And that's it. We're ready for gummy bears, and we're ready for the next step. So we'll toss back a couple gummy bears, and we'll move to the next step, which is gonna be the Z-axis, or Z-axis. Where in the world you might be, who knows? So let's collect all the parts for that. We'll get them sorted. We can see here that these two parts are specific. This one's got an L, the other one's got an R for left and right. Make sure that you put those in the right side. It is important. So these are the motor mounts. So there are two motors for the Z-axis, a left one and a right one. So we'll get these motor mounts mounted to the frame, and we will be able to move on to getting the motors mounted to these motor mounts. Nice and easy. So now we'll get our Z-axis motors. The motors and the spindles should be identical. The only differentiating thing is the length of the cables and that they say left and right on them. So for this portion, there are lots of screws involved. So we'll lay those out so that they are ready and available for us. And we know that we have the right amount before we start. So first things first, we'll put these two screw covers on each motor, and we'll notice that in the assembly guide it indicates that there are trapezoidal nuts that need to be removed. My motors and screws didn't have these on them. I did later find them in the box with the other motor parts. So if you have them on there, remove them. If not, they should be in your motor and screw box. So to get these long screws onto the motor mounts, you have to thread the screws or threaded rod through these holes. I just found it easier to line both motors up with the holes and drop it over like that. And then we'll go ahead and we will mount the motors to the mounts that are attached to the frame. These are 4 screws each, so at 8 in total. Make sure that your wiring for each motor is facing the right direction, obviously, so that they can be routed properly throughout the frame later on. And here are the trapezoidal nuts that I was talking about earlier, found in the box. And now we are going to get our trapezoidal nuts and attach them to the top of the frame. This is where The screws will ride up and down on the rods for the X-axis. So they give you a little window here to make sure that the nut is completely in there, so that when you put your screw in to hold the trapezoidal nut, it stays nice and secure. So now we get to drop the X-axis onto the threaded rods and screw them down a little bit so that we can securely mount the threaded rod and the slide rails that the X-axis will ride on. So to do that, we just place the X-axis on top, get those trapezoidal nuts onto the screws or threaded rods, and then try and turn both threaded rods at the same pace so that they catch, and then evenly draw the X-axis down. And then once we have the X-axis onto the threaded rod a little bit, we're able to drop these straight rods down to the bottom of the motor mounts, which makes it a little stiffer and secure and holds it really well into place. And then we have the caps. These will hold the tops of the threaded rod and the straight rod in place so that it doesn't move at the top of the frame. So a couple bolts will secure those, no problem. And once that's tightened up, look at that, more gummy bears. This time I've got new gummy bears. These are chocolate covered gummy bears and they are awesome. I love them. So we'll have a few of those and we will move to the next steps in the next part of the assembly journey for the Prusa. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.